Wonderful to see everybody. Thank you for joining us. As I wrote in my Shabbat thought, I hope you read it or will read it. It's the end of the trilogy of the stories of Jacob. And as I study this and I put it in the perspective of what I think is the most important way to read the Bible for personal transformation and insight, I probably should put that the other way around. That personal transformation requires insight. And one of the ways that we gain insight in our tradition, first of all, is just inner contemplation. We call it hitbonenut, just to contemplate what's going on inside yourself. But then the question is, of course, we can always deceive ourselves. We can always not admit what's happening in ourselves. We can always justify what's happening in ourselves. So if we're going to do an inner life reflection, which we should all do a little bit every day, and I posted a little reel, I think it's called, on Facebook that said at least some part of your day should be dedicated to caring for your soul, which means reflection on what's happening in the world of your soul. Because if you don't reflect on what's happening in the world of your soul, and you only live on the surface, your soul's journey and what I'm going to call the journey on the surface of consciousness are not connected. And then some people start to feel deeply disconnected from their life. They lack meaning, purpose, and direction. I want to share with you that sometimes when I've mentioned this in class, and I focused on the idea of waking up one day and you say to yourself, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know why I'm doing. I don't know what all this means. I don't understand the decisions that I've made. I don't know what to do about the decisions that I regret. And there's a great sense of pain that go over people's faces. And then when I mention that the soul is always at work, the soul has a wisdom all on its own, but it's not a wisdom that forces itself into the conscious mind. It oftentimes appears through dreams. It appears through passing feelings when we read something or watch something, and then we let it slide by. So in our tradition, I think a core part of our spiritual tradition is a constant practice of hitbonenut, inner reflection, but then we need aids to hitbonenut. We need aids to reflection, and our chief path is the study of text. Of course, we have prayer, we have reflection on its own, but Torah study is something that I think links every person serious about our tradition, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, anybody who studies Torah with an eye towards self-transformation. We take the text seriously. That's one thing that unites us. Everywhere you go, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, secular-oriented or any other denomination, if you take the text seriously, wherever you are and you find other people who take the text seriously, from what I recommend to be an archetypal perspective, there's already a deep conversation. It doesn't matter where you go, you have that in common. I just want to say another word about this. What I call the archetypal study of Torah is what you might call a construction of the meaning. This is a word from the study of canon, the holy texts of different peoples. What do we mean by a construction of the canon? The construction of a canon is an inner world view where the meaning of the text comes together. So I'll give you an example. When I was in graduate school, we studied, for example, the Christian construction of the Hebrew Bible and the traditionally Jewish construction of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the Christian constructions of the Hebrew Bible is a notion called prefiguration, which means there are many passages in the Hebrew Bible that prefigure what happens in the New Testament. So one thing that happens when you study New Testament in the Christian world, you find verses that take you back to the Hebrew Bible, and then of course the opposite is true. When you're studying the Hebrew Bible, you come across certain verses, it's a prefiguration of what happens later. Now, from a traditional Jewish view, there's an unconsciousness about the New Testament, as if it never existed. So sometimes a person will say, well, what does Judaism teach about, let's say, Jesus or something else? I say, officially, nothing. Officially, it's as if it didn't exist because we're so wrapped up in our study of Torah, our understanding of the tradition, that there's scant attention. There's no official version. Now, we're going to take a further step back and think of a scholarly view. A scholarly view looks at the Hebrew Bible with no attachment to its meaning, looks at the New Testament, no attachments to its meaning, and there's a whole different construction of the text. So what does the Bible mean? Well, you have the words on the page for sure. And words have meaning, they have semantic values, but what they mean deeply depends on your, what I'm going to call, construction of the text. And in some way, it's not debatable. One of the most futile, in my mind, futile uses of time is a person with one construction debating with a person with a different construction. So a devout Christian talking to a secular atheist, a Sam Harris type, I see them have debates, and I just think I think there are some people who like hearing the Bible debunked. That's their construction, is the Bible is debunkable. They get great joy out of that. I really don't find anything edifying from those conversations. My thought is you have 1,000 people in the room. Don't spend your time teaching them to disrespect the religion of other people. I don't think that's time well spent. It's my personal view. You can say, well, for example, if I were a atheist secular debunker, instead of getting up on the podium and making fun of someone else's religion, I would tell them what I take seriously. I would tell them what text I love. I would ask what text transforms me, and I would teach what I find meaningful instead of poking fun at what other people find meaningful. I don't find these debates edifying. So therefore, I feel now and then I should announce what I'll call my construction of the text is, as briefly as I can, so you all know. So, for example, I don't think the text is the Word of God, partly because it never says that. Genesis does not begin with, this is the very Word of God. Genesis does not begin in the first person. In the beginning, I created the heavens and the earth. It begins in the third person. So who was the third person narrator who witnessed time before time, creation before anything? It's obvious to me that there's a third person narrator. When I asked my local Chabad rabbi, I don't think I'd ever met an Orthodox Jew before. I said, how do you make sense of this? And I knew the Bible well enough. I'd been through Hebrew school confirmation. I taught and post-confirmation. I taught in the confirmation. I'd read the Bible. And ultimately, he says, well, it's Moses. I said, well, then why does it say, and God spoke to Moses saying? I said, and Moses said to God. Why does it intrude and say, this is the word of God that this is the word of God that I, Moses, received from God in the beginning. It doesn't say that either. So my Chabad rabbi went to, I think, sometimes the final position of those with a dogmatic attachment to the text, which is, you saw this coming, it's a mystery. It's a mystery. So I heard that, and I thought to myself, man, it's not mysterious to me, because I don't think God dictated the text. That's my construction. I do believe there is God. I do believe that God has a mind. I believe that God knows human beings. I believe in the gracious, loving care of God. I think God reveals God's truth to human beings. I think there are human beings who are especially receptive to the spiritual, moral truths of the divine. We might call those people who have had an experience of prophecy. I believe, for the most part, those who constructed the Bible were people who were touched by God. Clearly, from our perspective, and I think this is absolutely true, there are what we call ethical lapses in the Bible, things we're told to do and told not to do that, according to today, I think the Bible is deficient. And I don't mean this, I don't want to say that was then, this is now. I want to say on some absolute level of moral relativism, there are things taught in the Bible that don't pass moral standard today. That's just true. How do I understand it? Well, I don't say it's the Word of God, and nor do I say these people were deficient. I understand they lived in their time. So I don't spend my time pointing out the deficiencies in the Bible. I don't spend my time looking for all things that I disagree with. I just don't find that an edifying use of time. What I try to find are the parts of the Bible that seem to speak eternally. The laws, the adages, the poetry, and the literature that are timeless. That's my construction of the Bible. Although the Bible is definitely a child of its time, many parts of the Bible stand the test of time. So I go to those parts. I believe those are written by people who have been touched by the divine. Certainly I revere it because it has been preserved and revered by the people of Israel all through the generations and our sister religion, Christianity. I don't want to take that lightly, especially from the Jewish perspective. The labor that our people have put into this text, in the Talmud, the Midrash, the Zohar, The Hebrew Bible has been the foundation of a true labor of love and sacrifice. So we're down here, we're the receivers of this tradition, and I think we're called upon to read it for depth, meaning, and transformation. So I don't see the Bible as the Word of God. I see it as constructed by people who were touched by God for the most part, some parts less, some parts more, maybe even some parts not at all, and some parts especially. Therefore, I see the Bible as literature. Now, I have to tell you, in the Orthodox world, they don't like to hear that because they see all the Bible as more or less even, unless deepened by the Midrash. If the Midrash says it, it might be true. If the Midrash doesn't say it, it's not true. So sometimes I'll share a thought of mine, and they'll say, well, where does it say that? I said, well, I just said it. Well, is it in the Midrash? I said, no, I was studying and I thought it up. Like I see myself in the Viva Zornberg line, which is we take our depth to the text and we come up with Chidushim. And person says, well, if it's not in the Talmud, not in the Midrash, then it's meaningless. I don't think that. I think our understanding of the Torah progresses through time. And sometimes the insight of a person today, like in Aviva Zornberg and others, are as precious and valuable as something written 2,000 years ago. So I believe that the Bible is a profound literary quality. It leads to an interpretive depth. The interpretations are ongoing. What is an especially fertile way to understand Torah is through the lens of archetypal psychology. So what is eternal about the Torah? What's eternal about the Torah and many other parts of the Bible is that the characters have archetypal depth. To put it simply, it's not about what happened then, it's about what's happening now. So how does this promote insight? It promotes insight because as one knows the stories, and you put a tzohar, you put a prism onto the text, and it shines an inner light into the text. As the Baal Shem Tov says, you discover worlds and souls and angels. And those worlds and souls and angels in the depth of the text speak up into our souls. And they can actually bring enlightenment to us. And then we take our souls and pour it into the text, and we might have a chiddush. We might have a new interpretation. So it's a constant dialectical process of the text speaking into us and our speaking into the text. All right, so let's now go ahead and look at the text. To understand today's Parsha, I want to go back to last week's Parsha. We spent most of our time last week on that extraordinary image of Jacob and the ladder, Jacob on the road, thinking about Jack Kerouac, Jacob on Highway 61. And that's a profound image. And Jacob, who's lost everything, does not know who he is. And I think it's a wonderful archetypal image. Many people, including I, find that meaningful because many of you have had that moment when you say, like Abraham, now like Jacob, I've got to get out of here for one reason or the other. I don't quite know who I am. I don't quite understand what just happened to me. I got to go to somewhere new. And I got to figure this thing out. I've been there in my life. Maybe you've been there in that life. Even if you haven't traveled widely and left the physical place, I think every thinking, feeling human being goes through the moment of Va-Yishlach. Got to get out of here. And then you're going to arrive somewhere, and that's where you're going to try to create meaning and purpose in your life until you do it again. So I want to go to the end of last week's Torah portion, and I'm asking this question. Today, I hope to get to the point where we see the confrontation between Esav. I don't believe Jacob fought an angel. I think he fought his brother Esav in that wrestling match in the middle of the night. And Esav says, your name is no longer Yaakov, the usurper. Your name is now Yisrael, Kisarita im Elohim ve'im anashim batuchal. You have struggled with beings divine and mortal, and you have prevailed. How did Esav know that? How do we know that? What did Jacob go through? So last week's Torah portion was about the trials and travails of Jacob. Im Lavan Garti. I lived with Laban. Now I lived in a terrible place. People tell me I had a terrible job. I had a terrible relationship. Things were really horrible. But I had to come out with my dignity intact. I didn't want to come out angry and depressed and resenting. It was terrible there. But I was able to survive. So if you look at the end of last week's Torah portion, Jacob realizes things have come to an end with his uncle Lavan. He gathers his family. In fact, it says in the beginning of chapter 31. You don't have to go there, I'll read it, but if you want to, go to chapter 31, verse 2. Jacob says in chapter 31, verse 2, he gathers his family. He says, Vayar Yaakov et penei Lavan, v'hine enenu imo kitamo shilshom. Now, the penei Lavan, panim means face, but also means inner disposition, mood, feeling, affect. So the word face has, in a way, does not refer to face when it's used metaphorically, but refers to depth. He said there's something about what Laban is feeling, what he's going through. It's not like before. Something bad has happened. I got to get out of here. So Jacob is fleeing again. Just as he had to flee from his brother Esau 20 years earlier, he feels he has to flee from his uncle Lavan. Of course, Esau's uncle as well. So as he takes off, Lavan catches up with him. Now, by the way, Lavan has had a dream to treat Jacob rightly. I'm really glad that happened. Things might have not have gone as well. If you want to see that, look in chapter 31, verse 24. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said, beware lest you speak with Jacob either good or bad. So God didn't tell him what to say. He said, just be utterly fair and square, measure your words. By the way, why is Lavan called Lavan ha'Arami in verse 20? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, the word Arami has a nice play of words here. So let's go to the end of the parsha. Lavan catches up with him, and now Jacob takes a stand. I'll just go ahead and read from the English. Jacob became angered and took up his grievance with Lavan. And Jacob spoke and said, what is my transgression? What is my sin? Ma pish'i u'ma chatoti. What is my sin that you have pursued me? You have rummaged through all my things. What did you find in all the household objects? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen. Let them decide between the two of us. And then he goes on. For 20 years I've worked for you. Your ewes and your she-goats I've never miscarried, nor did I eat the rams of your flock. That which was mangled I never brought you. I myself would bear the loss. From me you would extract it, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night. This is how I was. By day scorching heat consumed me, and frost by night. My sleep drifted between my eyes. This is my 20 years in your household. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 100 times. Had not the God of my father, God of Abraham, and my father, he calls him the dread of Isaac, Pachad Yitzchak. Side note here, Pachad is always translated as the fear of Isaac. That's clearly not what it means here. It makes no sense. People say, oh, Pachad because Isaac feared at the time during the binding of Isaac. I think that's a stretch. Did a little bit of research. Where else do we find the word pachad in the Bible that makes sense? This is for those of you who like to look up the intricacies of Hebrew language. You don't have to go there. I'm going to read it to you, but if you want to go there, I'll give you a minute. Turn your Bibles to the book of Job, chapter 40, verse 17. The book of Job, chapter 40, verse 17. It's a little bit alarming. What I'm going to tell you now is rated R. So any little kids in the room, go ahead and get a drink of water or something. And it's only going to take a few seconds. So we're going to go to the book of Job, chapter 40, verse 17. See how quickly I can find it. If you didn't know anything about Leviathan, you're going to see it here, and then you're going to have to look it up later. Okay, so Tehillim, Proverbs, and then Iyov. And let's see, Proverbs, Iyov. A minute here. We should probably have Jeopardy music playing when I'm looking things up here. All right, if you have an Art Scroll Bible, you will find it on pages 1674, 1675, the book of Job, chapter 40. Now this is God in God's presentation of God's power. How dare you, Job, rebuke me when I am the God of power? I know more than you know. I know mysteries of which you cannot even conceive. So we go down to verse 15. It says, Hine na behemot asher asiti. Look now at the behemoths. These are primordial animals like dragons or something that I have created. He's grass like cattle. Behold, his strength is in his loins. His might is in the navel of his abdomen. When he wishes, I'll look at the Hebrew here in verse 17. Yachpotz zenavo como ares. When he wants, his tail is like that of a tree. Gide pachto or pachadav Yistoragu. They become woven together. Well, what are pachadim here? Pachadim is testicles. Some translations say stones. Some translations say the power of his thighs. It means something like his productive forces. So if you look in the word pachad in a biblical dictionary, it says fear. You go three down, citing the Aramaic and the Arabic. It means something like the procreative force in male genitalia. Now we go back to Pachad Yitzhak, where he says, my father Abraham, and the creative power of my father Isaac. The creative power of my father Isaac. So I'm not reading as the dread of Isaac. Side note, back to the text. Had they not been with me, meaning something like the virility of had my father Abraham and the virility of my father Isaac, had they not been with me, you would have surely now sent me away empty-handed. God saw my wretchedness and the toil of my hands, and that's why he admonished you last night. So Jacob knows about Laban's dream. Laban says, the daughters are my daughters. Your children are my children. The flock is my flock. Everything you see here is mine. Now Laban has played his cards. This is exactly what's been going on the whole time. Laban was never going to let him go. He was going to claim the daughters. He was going to claim the sons. He was going to claim the flocks. And it's exactly what he was going to do. He was going to send Jacob away empty-handed. Okay? So Jacob discerned this, and he fled. Now, because Laban has been forewarned, Laban now says, come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and it shall be a witness. And Jacob says, okay, let's gather stones in together. By the way, remember when Jacob was coming from Beersheba up to Padan Aram? He goes to sleep and gathers stones around his head. So we see a prefiguration there of what's happening here. Just as when he left Canaan, he gathered stones. As he's going back to Canaan, he's gathering stones. And we're going to call it Gal Ed, a mound of witness, or in Aramaic, Yegar Sahaduta. The mound is a witness between me and you. And then here are Laban's conditions. If you ill-treat my daughters, if you'll marry any wives beyond my daughters, even if no one sees it, God is a witness between me and you. So he basically says, don't mistreat my daughters and don't have wives that will supersede my daughters. Okay, that seems to be their agreement. And it says further in 53, may the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, their common ancestor, the God of their father, and Jacob swore by the virility of his father Isaac, and he made a sacrifice. Last week's Torah portion ends in verse 32. Laban kisses sons and daughters and blessed them, meaning his grandchildren. He went in peace. Jacob went his way, and angels of God encountered him. Just as angels of God escorted Jacob out of the land of Canaan, angels of God escort him back into the land of Canaan. And what are these called? They're Malachei Elohim. They are emissaries of the divine. Remember, the word malach, angel, is from the word melacha, which means toil. So as my teacher taught me, packets of divine energy on a mission. You can note that down. That came from my teacher, Jonathan Omerman. I said, what's an angel? He said, packets of divine energy on a mission. Never heard a better definition. Now we go into our parsha, and now we have in mind what Jacob went through for 20 years. He lived with Laban. Now remember what Laban did? When Jacob fell in love with Rachel and wanted to marry her, Laban said, that's fine. Okay? Worked for 7 years. And Jacob worked for 7 years. And then what Laban do? He switched Leah for Rachel. There's a great body of midrash, how the two sisters pulled this off. Jacob woke up. It was Leah, not Rachel. And he said to Laban, "What's going on?" And Laban says, "Oh, we don't do that here where you marry the younger instead of the older. You got to marry the older first." Jacob could have said, "You could have told me that." And in the Midrash, the people are dancing around saying Lavan ha'arami, and a ramai in Hebrew is a cheat. A ramai in Hebrew is a cheat. So sometimes when the Torah says Lavan ha'arami, Lavan ha'ramai, the cheat. Okay, it goes deeper. In the Midrash, the people are singing something like the following: "What you did with your brother Esau has now been done to you." Karma, payback. And as Jacob thinks, he tricked me. He substituted one person for the other. I just can't imagine. I think the text and the Midrash is calling out to us. Jacob had a moment of recognition. What happened to me is what I did to somebody else. And it's not just what I did to my brother, what they did to me. It's the human condition. People cheat each other. People mask. People don't give other the full information. People hide. It's the human condition. So Jacob says to himself, "Yeah, I'm not too different from Laban. He is my uncle. My mother is his sister. What the plot that my mother contrived, definitely that's the family heritage, all the way back perhaps to Nahor." And in my mind, Jacob has this moment of awakening: who he is, who his brother is, who his uncle is, what his family tree is like. And then Jacob has a moment where he has to ask himself. Again, this is my archetypal reconstruction of Jacob. And Jacob has to decide something like, I don't want to be this way. The way I term it in my wisdom work, it might be my personality. It doesn't have to be my character. Some people by their personality hide. Some people by their personality are conflict avoidant. Some people want to get what they want by working in darkness. That might be personality. It might be an adaptive trait handed down from our troglodyte ancestors. Then you're aware that's you. And then you decide, but I don't want to be that way. Maybe it's my genetic inheritance. Maybe it's my personality. There are so many things that we call our flaws, which are simply evolutionarily adaptive. But we have insight. We can reflect. And we can come up with a moral standard and say to yourself, the behaviors that seem to be derived habitually from my personality don't meet my moral standard. That, folks, is a moment of great transformation. What I do habitually does not meet my moral standard. You got to have a clear moral standard, and you have to have sufficient insight. And again, here's the way I phrase it. That's my personality. That's not my moral character. And I will work as hard as I can to bring my moral character in line with my vision. I want to bring my moral character in line with my vision. In my reconstruction of the archetype of Jacob, something like this happens to him. Maybe when the angels come to him, maybe that's some of the divine message. You went out of here one way, you're going to go back a different person. You're not going to go back after these 20 years as the same person. By the way, some people come back as the same person. Some people go through 20 years of difficult experience and they haven't changed a bit. Other people go through those experiences and the things from the outside produce change on the inside. So Jacob goes back. Now, he has to be ready. As I wrote in my Shabbat thought, he's ready for a fight and also ready for a truce. He's ready for either. He has no idea what's coming. So he divides his family into Machanayim, two different camps. So if Esau attacks one camp, another camp might survive. Oh, by the way, when the angels come to him at the end of last week's Parsha, he said, this is a godly camp. He called that place Machanayim. So something about the Machanayim has some kind of divine imprimatur. He divides the camp up. He's living in great fright. And I want to say about this idea of fear before a fight. I just have to say politically, I think about many times of the Israeli conflict with those who want to destroy Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and of course others. Israelis have great confidence in their military. It takes me back to 1948, 1967. When the State of Israel was established in 48, Ben-Gurion's cabinet, his the Haganah and the others, they said, what do you think if we declare independence? This is November 47. And Ben-Gurion said, I think we have a 50-50 chance, okay? Which did not sound good 2 years after the Holocaust had ended. And Ben Gurion says, we have a 50-50 chance. Should we go for it? And the Zionist Congress at the time, they voted after the UN said, yeah, there'll be two different states, the Jewish state and the Palestinian state. Palestinians, of course, rejected it, and the Arab Legion decided to destroy Israel. And Ben Gurion said, we're going to go for it. Now, I'm just trying to imagine what that felt, right? If you looked at the Arab press, it was, we're going to murder every Jew. We're going to burn you alive. We're going to cut your throats. We're going to push you into the ocean. 2 years after the Holocaust, you had to take that seriously. But on the other hand, people said, we're not going to give an inch. We're not going to surrender one settlement. We're going to fight to the death. If we're going to die, it's not because we're rushed into the ocean and slaughtered. We're going to die at our posts. And you read I get emotional. I think about it. When you read the War of Independence, and by the way, Mirav's father was in the Haganah and in the Israeli military during the War of Independence. He told some tough stories. But there's a sense of, we have nowhere to run to. We have nowhere to run. Yeah, we take you people seriously. On one hand, you're terrifying us. But even more deeply than the terror is the resilience and the valor. Okay? So you look at 1967. Again, enemies round about Israel. You look at the newsreels. Just go newsreels, Egypt, May 1967. Death to the Jews, massacre the Jews, cut their throats, pile their skulls on the beaches in Tel Aviv. That's what Israelis were seeing in the newsreels at those times. And you ask people, they say, yeah, on one hand, we were terrified. Because if someone said to me, I'm going to destroy you, I'm going to burn you, I'm going to kill everybody in your family, I'm going to cut your throats and pile your skulls up in your front yard, yeah, that would scare me. And then I say, okay, I'm scared, but I'm also resilient. So, right, if there's going to be a fight, I'm properly put on notice that this is a fight to the death, but I'm not going to fight in a fearful manner. I'm going to fight in a way to win. So this idea, what Jacob did, is he said, I'm ready for a fight, but I intend to win this fight. And the main thing in a fight is, if you fight afraid, you're likely to lose. If you fight with resilience toward victory, you're more likely to win. And that's how I see Jacob. He says, I'm ready for a fight. I don't want to fight. I don't want to kill anybody. I don't want my family killed, but I'm ready. So Jacob gets ready for the fight, and then he's left alone. Now, another thing about Esau. What is Esau's state of mind as Jacob's coming back over? And I talked about this deeply in my Shabbat thought and last night. I'll take a little, maybe a 5-minute detour now on my so-called Midrash of Rebekah. Esau has stayed behind for 20 years. He starts out with rage. And I have my fantasy is Rebekah now is teaching at the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever, the ancient spiritual, moral wisdom academy outside of any religion. And if you look at the book of Proverbs, you look at the moral wisdom of any tradition, including my interpretation called wisdom work, the first thing is get in control of your feelings and your emotions and know which feelings and emotions produce thriving as a human being. Rage and resentment is not one of them. Justice is. Rage and resentment is not one. However, whatever the stairway to heaven is not populated by rage and resentment. That is the stairway to hell. In some way, Rebekah was able to say to her son, you're justified. You should hate me. You should hate your father. You should hate your brother. You should hate God because you were set up. But rage, resentment, outrage is not going to get you any further. You'll be stuck here your entire life until the day you die. You won't be a proper husband. You won't be a proper father. You'll be no good to anybody. In fact, ultimately, you're going to be toxic waste everywhere you go. Now, I don't know if she said it to him that way, but eventually Esau had to know that. So I imagine under his mother's careful love, he was able to say, yeah, I have the right to be angry. I have the right to be resentful at every single one of you, but it won't get me anywhere, and it's not going to make anything better. So if there's going to be healing in this awful tragedy between me and my brother and my mother and my father and God, if there's going to be any healing here, the question is, do I want to be on the side of healing, or do I want to be on the side of making it worse? And I think that's an existential decision in so many places in our life. Do we want to be part of the healing, or do we want to be a part of the destruction? Now, I have to account for Esau's incredible grace and wisdom in our Parsha. And the only thing I can think to myself is, he learned. Where did he learn? Well, he stayed home. Who was the person who got the oracle about the brothers in the womb? His mother, Rebecca. According to the Midrash, she got the revelation at the Beit Midrash, the yeshiva of Shem and Ever. According to my reconstruction, she goes back there where she got the wisdom. What special wisdom does she give him? As I wrote in my Shabbat thought, Leviticus 19, verses 17 and 18. Do not hate in your heart and do not bear grudges. Love your neighbor, but the word rea can mean neighbor, but it can mean someone who's dear to you, your friend. It says in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 and 18, do not hate your brother in your heart. Do not hold grudges, but rather love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? So my fantasy is that was Rebecca's specialty. As it were, she wrote her doctoral dissertation on those two verses. She taught everything in the curriculum. That was her specialty. Her son Esau attended every class. In that class, he sat up in the front row, in the center. He took the class over and over again until it sank in. Don't hold grudges. Don't hate in your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's not simple. It's not simple. People say it. Jesus said it. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then how many people do you meet of every religious persuasion that know it theoretically, but they don't live like that? You look at how they feel, how they think, how they conduct themselves. They may see themselves as loving. And sometimes I would point this out. And I say, well, what about that person? They would say, well, that person doesn't deserve it. I said, oh, because I have to look the Bible up. Because I thought the Bible said, don't hate in your heart, don't bear grudges, love your neighbor as yourself, unless they don't deserve it. I can't find that. I can't find that exemption. Nor can I find it in the Midrash, nor in any other source. It doesn't say don't hate unless they deserve it. It doesn't say don't hold grudges unless they deserve it. And it doesn't say love your neighbor in your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, unless they don't deserve it. It never says that anywhere. So where do people get that from? Because I hear it every time a person hates, they say, well, but that person doesn't deserve it. Right? Their Yetzer Hara comes up with it. That's what the Yetzer Hara does. It takes great moral maxims, and then it gives escape clauses. So we don't have to live up to what the Bible's telling us. Now, I'm not saying people don't hurt us and people don't treat us unfairly and we got to go get justice. The question is whether hatred and grudges adds to getting justice. Maybe for a particularly timid person, they got light a little bit of fire of hatred and resentment to get themselves in motion. That's possible. I've seen that before. But then once the fire is lit and the motivation toward justice is moving forward, best to turn that fire down, because it will poison you. It will destroy you. This is my theory of my midrash of Rebecca, the midrash of Rebecca, the teaching of Rebecca to Isaac. What I need to do now is find all the verses in the Bible that, in my mind, populate the teaching of Rebecca, Torah Rivka, and core to it is Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 and 18. Applies specifically to Esau. Don't hate your brother in your heart. Don't bear grudges. And somehow Esau internalized that. That's my point of view. That's my, I think, core teaching for today, taking my mind off of Jacob and putting my mind on Esau. How did Esau become the man who was able to bless Jacob in the unique way that he did? Which is why you can see I'm simply not buying into the rest of the Bible that hates Esau. That was historically constructed because of the animosity between the Israelites and the Edomites. For the rabbis, Edom was a euphemism for Edom. The Edomites was a euphemism for the Romans. If we just go back to this, not only is it uncalled for, doesn't name the story, we miss something deep in the story. And this is missing in our tradition. It's missing in the Midrash, missing in the Talmud. What's missing is our tradition able to see Esau as he is in the Bible, because the tradition is so shaped by the later history. So what I'm asking myself to do, all of us to do, you're going to read it everywhere when you read about Esau. Just, this is my opinion, retract all that, ignore all that. It was historically contingent on the Edomites and the Romans. Let's go back just to this story. And what I hope to do, now that I have a conception of what the Torah Rivka is actually, at some point, write a few pages on the Torah Rivka and the transformation of Esav. It's missing in our tradition. There should be several pages in the Talmud and several pages in the Midrash and several pages in the Zohar on this topic. It's missing. So I want to create a movement. Okay, Friends of Esav. I think about 10 years ago at Oratora, we thought that having little buttons called Friends of Esav. So we're gonna put that into action. So now you can see from this perspective, when Esav arrives to Jacob, he knows what's happened. Another part of my fantasy is Esav has had informers in Laban's camp the whole time. It was his uncle Laban. They're probably transient workers back and forth. And they kept saying to him, man, you do have no idea what your brother's going through. It is terrible for him up here. And Esav says, well, how's he handled it? Pretty straight up. He's not cheating him back. And, more or less, he's defending himself. But on the other hand, just as he said, he hasn't stolen anything. And he hasn't... He did work something with the flocks, with some kind of a miracle. But as far as outright genevis and violence, it didn't happen. So Esav is learning, well, the guy suffered. And my brother has personally experienced his own version of what he did to me. I think Esav and Rebekah take this intel, they talk about it, and they say, it seems that Jacob is not the man he was. Jacob is not the kind of guy who's going to go along with what he did before. What would he have done now? He would have probably stood up to you. We have to have a confrontation. We're going to have to work this thing out. We're going to create a mound of stones. It's going to be the Gal Ed between you and me. We've got to work this thing out. Okay, so this is my fantasy of Esav and Rebekah's construction of what Jacob is now like. Right? So maybe Esav says to himself, true enough. But what is withholding Jacob from becoming the person he can be? So he says, my brother's on a spiritual journey. Maybe he's not that person yet. Now try to imagine. There's somebody where there's some kind of deep wound. And you say, I think they're on a path to repair. But one burden they're carrying is what they did to me. But I think they've transformed. I can be neutral. Or I can do something incredibly gracious and give them the key to the last door. I'm going to give them the key to the last door. I'm the only one that has that key. If I withhold that key, they'll never go through that door. I have the key. So what was the key? Esav comes to him at night, and they fight. And in my opinion, Esav was the former outdoorsman. Now he's getting his doctorate at the Beit Midrash of Shem and Ever. But he knew how to fight. He had been out in the field before. And I think he's testing Jacob. Is Jacob going to run? Is he going to play dirty? Something bad going to happen here? And he sees, well, my brother's fighting. This guy's fighting pretty fair and square. And at that point, Esav taps out, as we say in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He says, let me go. I got to go. And Jacob has it in a grip. He said, not unless you bless me. How strange is that? Okay, let's go back to the verse. This is in verse 27, 32:27. It says, Vayomer shlacheni ki Allah hashachar. Let me go. Sun's coming up. Vayomer, he says, no. Lo ashalechacha ki im berachtani. I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. At that point, he knew it was Esav. I don't think there's any sport as up close and personal as his grappling and wrestling. He knew it's his brother. And his brother said, okay, you got me. Let me go. And Jacob says, not unless you bless me. This was the singular blessing Jacob needed. And I think maybe in his mind, just admit that I have the birthright. I didn't set this up. I didn't want this. I never asked for it. Our mother did it. God told her to do it. Right? Yeah, I did it, but it wasn't my idea. Just say I have the birthright and let's not have a war. That's probably as far as Jacob thought he could take it. But what did Esav say? Something very strange. Okay, I'm going to bless you. What's your name? He says, Jacob. He answered. He didn't have time to come up with why, what a dumb question. He just answered the question. Asked, answered. And now, one of the most remarkable lines in the entire Bible, in all of Western literature. It propels so much visual. It impels a vast amount of literature this moment. No longer will your name be Jacob, but Israel. Kisarita im Elohim ve'im anashim batuchal. If you had never read this story before, you knew nothing about it, and you got here, you would be flabbergasted. You would have never seen this coming. That if you detected this was Esau, and I think any fair reader would, Esau says those words, and I believe that Jacob is overwhelmed with what has just happened. His stained identity of being the usurper has now been lifted from him, and somebody sees him. Panim el panim, depth to depth, soul to soul. Esau says, I know what you've been through. I know what you've struggled with. You've struggled with Elohim. Now, what is the word Elohim? It can mean God. But Elohim can mean a judge as well, as when Moses and Aaron are Elohim to Pharaoh, they're the judges of Pharaoh. It can mean mighty. A Ruach Elohim might not mean a spirit of God. It might mean a mighty spirit. Sarita im Elohim, you have fought with immense things. Takes me back to the poem that Shanti shared with us last night of Rilke's reading of this. It says, what we choose to fight is so tiny. What fights us is so great. This sense that immense storms come into our life and we're transformed by these storms, these immense things. And I think perhaps what Esau is saying, you have been struggling with immense things. The immensity of destiny, the immensities of our ancestors, the immensity of being born out of order, the immensity of God wanting to repair this, but not able to directly switch our birth order, the immensity of the burden of Rebecca to put this thing into motion, the immensity of your guilt, the immensity of Isaac's passivity, the immensity of my anger, the immensity of your suffering under Laban. Sarita im Elohim, you've been struggling with something immense and mighty and powerful. Ve'im anashim, you fought me. You fought your uncle Laban. You fought your own demons. You've been fighting this thing. Vatuchal, and you have prevailed. Only Esau would get that blessing. Now, just try to imagine someone gives that blessing to you. Try to imagine someone says to you, you've been fighting with immense things your whole life, and you stood up to it. Now, we don't get the name change, but we can have an internal change. And for me, that's part of what the high holidays are. Every year, try to imagine the divine saying to you, Sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim. You've been dealing with immense things. You've been dealing with all kinds of people. Vatuchal. You've stood up to it. So try to imagine that's the secret name of the people of Israel. Whether you're born as an Israelite, whether you've chosen to become an Israelite, whether you're affiliated with the Israelite faith, in any way that this text speaks to you, we are all Israelites. We are the wrestlers of God. We are the people who face immense things, and we prevail, and that's our inner name. Esau grants him that inner name. I love the end here where Jacob says, what's your name? And I think to myself, wait a minute, are you wearing a mask or are you really Esau? He says, so he says, why do you inquire of my name? Meaning I'm obviously Esau. And I brought up in my devotor one last thing about Esau. Esau is the descendant of Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel. God preferred Abel. Cain killed Abel. You look at the sibling rivalry. God preferred Jacob. Esau doesn't kill Jacob. He goes more than that. He gives Jacob the singular blessing. So he says, I'm Esau. I'm Esau, your brother. Cain said, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Esau took the question mark away. He said, Shomer anochi ani, I am my brother's keeper. Right? I will be the one who will care for you at this moment. And of course, later on in the Parsha, we need to get to it. So Jacob says, I've seen God face to face, and my soul has been saved, meaning Esau. Seeing God face to face, I've seen the immensity things, depth to depth. I think that means his brother Esau. a little bit later when he meets up with Esau, he says the same thing, seeing your face like seeing God's face. When you see it this way, everything in the story comes together. But I want to drill down to that moment of Esau seeing his brother, knowing his brother, acknowledging what he's gone through, changing his name, and being an agent of this most transformative narrative in the Bible, and maybe even in all of Western literature.